Welcome to today's scary story session. These stories are not for the faint of heart, so be prepared to be scared out of your wits. If you enjoy being scared and want to hear more stories like these, be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a scary story session. Let's get started. The hospital was always a place of comfort and care, but that all changed when patients began vanishing without a trace. The disappearances were shrouded in mystery, and no one could explain how patients were going missing from their rooms, seemingly without a trace. The first few disappearances were chalked up to administrative errors, but as the numbers grew, the hospital staff became increasingly worried. It was clear that something sinister was happening within the walls of the hospital, and they were powerless to stop it. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the disappearances were not isolated incidents. There were patterns, connections between the missing patients that suggested a darker, more sinister force was at work. Whispers and rumors spread throughout the hospital, and staff members began to report strange and unexplainable occurrences. Lights flickered, doors slammed shut on their own, and eerie whispers echoed through the halls at night. Then, one day, a nurse made a chilling discovery. In a remote corner of the hospital, hidden behind a locked door, she found a room that had been forgotten for years. It was small, with nothing more than a few cobweb-covered chairs and a table, but it felt like a place of pure evil. As the investigation deepened, the staff began to realize that they were dealing with something far more sinister than just a string of disappearances. They were up against an entity that defied explanation, an ancient, malevolent force that had been lurking in the shadows of the hospital for years. As the situation spiraled out of control, staff members began to fall ill, one by one. Some were stricken with sudden and inexplicable illnesses, while others were consumed by a sense of overwhelming dread that seemed to cling to them like a shroud. The hospital was thrown into a state of chaos, as staff members scrambled to save themselves and their patients from the unseen danger that lurked in the shadows. In the end, it was a fight for survival, a battle against an unknown enemy that threatened to claim them all. In the early 2000s, a small hospital in rural America found itself the center of a terrifying mystery. It began when a patient, a middle-aged man who appeared otherwise healthy, was admitted to the hospital after collapsing on the street. Upon examination, doctors found no obvious signs of illness or injury. However, the man was convinced that something was terribly wrong with him. He spoke of feeling watched and followed, of hearing whispers in the darkness, and of experiencing terrifying visions. As the days went on, the man's condition worsened. He grew increasingly paranoid and delusional, and began to lash out at the hospital staff. Despite their best efforts, the man died in his hospital bed a week after being admitted. It was only after the man's death that hospital staff noticed the small, intricately carved wooden box that had been among his belongings. The box had been tucked away in a corner of the man's room, and no one had paid much attention to it before. However, as soon as the box was discovered, strange and unsettling things began to happen. At first, the staff attributed the strange occurrences to mere coincidence. But as time went on, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. Patients began to experience the same terrifying visions and nightmares that the first patient had reported. They spoke of seeing shadowy figures lurking in the corners of their rooms, of feeling cold fingers brush against their skin in the middle of the night, and of hearing eerie whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The staff, too, began to feel the effects of the curse, They reported feeling watched and followed, even when they were alone. Some claimed to have seen the box move on its own, as if it had a life of its own. Others reported feeling as though they were being strangled by an invisible force. Despite their mounting terror, the staff found it difficult to take action against the cursed box. They were afraid that destroying it would only make matters worse, or that the curse might attach itself to them and follow them home. So they kept the box under lock and key, hoping that the curse would eventually fade away on its own. However, the curse only seemed to grow stronger. Patients continued to suffer, and the staff grew increasingly desperate. It was only after a young nurse, a woman named Sarah, began to experience the same terrifying visions as the patients that they realized they had to act. Together, a group of the bravest hospital staff decided to destroy the box. They took it to a nearby field, dug a pit, and burned it in a ritualistic ceremony. As the flames consumed the box, the hospital was suddenly filled with a sense of peace and calm. The visions and nightmares ceased, and the staff and patients felt as if a great weight had been lifted from their shoulders. The story of the Angel of Death began in the 1970s, when a young nurse named Janine Jones started working at a hospital in San Antonio, Texas. At first, she seemed like a model employee, friendly, competent, and dedicated to her patients. But soon, things started to go wrong. Patients under Jones's care began dying unexpectedly and in suspicious circumstances. At first, the deaths were attributed to natural causes or medical complications. But as the number of deaths increased, hospital staff became suspicious. An investigation was launched, and it uncovered a chilling pattern. Jones had been intentionally overdosing patients with powerful medications in order to hasten their deaths. She had a preference for targeting young children, and many of her victims were infants and toddlers. The investigation also uncovered a history of abuse and neglect. Jones had a troubled childhood and had been in and out of foster care. She had a history of drug abuse and erratic behavior, and had been fired from previous nursing jobs for stealing drugs and neglecting patients. The hospital was devastated by the revelation that one of its own employees had been responsible for such horrific crimes. The families of the victims were left to grapple with the loss of their loved ones, and the knowledge that their deaths had been intentional. Jones was ultimately convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. But the story did not end there. In the years that followed, more evidence came to light that suggested that Jones had actually killed far more patients than she had been charged with. The case of the Angel of Death shook the medical community and the public alike. It raised uncomfortable questions about the trust that patients and their families place in medical professionals, and about the systems that are supposed to prevent such abuses of power. To this day, the memory of Janine Jones and her heinous crimes haunt the hospital where she once worked, and the families who were touched by her evil actions. In the early 2000s, a hospital in the United States found itself in the midst of a nightmare scenario when its water supply became contaminated with a deadly toxin. The hospital, like many others, relied on a complex network of pipes and fixtures to deliver clean water to patients and staff. However, what began as a few isolated cases of patients falling ill soon turned into a full-blown crisis. At first, hospital staff were perplexed by the sudden spike in patients falling ill. The symptoms were vague and difficult to pinpoint, ranging from fever and cough to respiratory distress and pneumonia. But as more and more patients began to exhibit the same symptoms, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. The hospital immediately took action, shutting down the water supply and installing filters and other safety measures. But it was too late for some of the patients and staff members who had already been exposed to the contaminated water. The toxin was later identified as Legionella bacteria, a type of bacterium that causes a severe form of pneumonia known as Legionnaire's disease. Legionella thrives in warm, stagnant water, making it a particular threat to hospitals and other large buildings with complex water systems. As the outbreak continued, the true extent of the damage became clear. Multiple patients died, and many more were left with permanent health complications. The hospital was forced to conduct a thorough investigation to determine the source of the contamination and to ensure that it would never happen again. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern of neglect and mismanagement. The hospital's plumbing system had not been properly maintained, and the bacteria had been allowed to grow and spread unchecked. There were dead ends and blind spots in the system that allowed stagnant water to accumulate, providing the perfect breeding ground for Legionella. The hospital ultimately took responsibility for the outbreak, acknowledging that they had failed in their duty to provide safe and clean water to their patients and staff. They took measures to compensate the victims and their families and implemented a comprehensive plan to prevent future outbreaks. The contaminated water outbreak was a tragic reminder of the importance of maintaining safe and clean water supplies in hospitals and other healthcare facilities. It was a sobering reminder that even seemingly mundane aspects of hospital infrastructure can have deadly consequences if not properly managed. It also highlighted the need for increased awareness and education around the risks of Legionella and other waterborne pathogens.